Joining us now for more insight into the war as it stands today and these peace negotiations, he's former advisor to the SecDef and co-chair of the group called Our Country, Our Choice, retired U.S. Army Colonel Doug Macgregor, back on the program. Colonel, nice to see you again. Man, it has been years of you and I coming on this program and discussing this war with no end in sight, and I thought last week there might be an end in sight, and then the weekend and this week happened, and we had hundreds of drone strikes and attacks from Russia, and then the EU telling Zelensky, you can fire long range into Russia, pissing Putin off. And here we go. The battle intensifies. And all Trump's trying to do, as he says every day, I'm trying to stop the killing. I'm tired of the killing on both sides. Colonel, what's going on?
Well, I think the conditions that you put up first that President Putin outlined are not new. They have been established for a very long time. The second thing is that President Trump seems to be receiving what people want him to hear. The Ukrainians, in the weeks before the recent attacks that the Russians launched against them, they launched 1,400 drones and long-range strike missiles, including ATACMS, at civilian targets in Moscow and around Moscow.
I didn't know that.
Well, of course not.
That wasn't reported.
That's right. And apparently, President Trump is unaware of that as well. In addition, he spoke up at Morristown, New Jersey's airport where he was preparing to come back to Washington. And someone asked him about what appears to have been an attempt to kill President Putin when he was in a helicopter near Kursk, transiting between Kursk and Moscow. And he said he didn't know that.
How would, okay, who's not giving him this intelligence? The commander-in-chief needs to know this stuff. If you're negotiating with two other world leaders and this side tries to kill this side's leader while you're the guy in the middle negotiating peace, shouldn't he know that?
Yeah, well, I think so. Then there's one last point that everybody seems to miss, and that is that we are not an objective bystander. We're a co-belligerent. We started the war in Ukraine. We're the ones that installed, through a coup, an anti-Moscow, anti-Russian government in Kiev in 2014.
Right, under Obama. You and I have talked about that.
We're the ones that have poured huge quantities of money into Ukraine to build up this Ukrainian military establishment that at the time the Russians went into eastern Ukraine numbered over 800,000, half of whom were reservists and the other half were full-time soldiers, and a very well-equipped and lethal force, frankly. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is that it's very difficult to negotiate as some sort of third party when you're actually responsible for the survival of this Kiev regime, which is why I've said from the beginning, if Mr. Trump's serious about ending the war and stopping the killing, the first thing you do is stop funding and supporting this Ukrainian regime. They're the ones that have committed the atrocities against civilians in eastern Ukraine. They're the ones that have been targeting civilians inside Russia. All of this nonsense that's heaped on the Russians is just that. It's nonsense. It's propaganda. It's not true. The Russians have been extraordinarily careful. The other thing is the only reason there's still a Ukrainian regime and a Ukrainian army of any kind, which is not saying them very much at this point, is that the Russians don't want to go any further west. The last thing they want to do is end up responsible for a bunch of Ukrainians. They don't want to govern or administer Ukrainians. They're only interested in what's Russian, and what's Russian is what they currently control.
So, Colonel, you're not of the mindset when we hear the folks in the EU and in the press that Putin is this big Hitler-like guy who's trying to take over the world, and if we don't stop him on the east side of Ukraine, then the next thing we know, we're going to be eating borscht in New York. Is that what they eat in Russia? I don't even know.
That's a lot of nonsense.
But they say it, right? They scare us that way.
Well, borscht isn't all that bad, depending upon where you buy it. But I just think it's a lot of nonsense. It's been nonsensical talk from the beginning, and a lot of us voted for President Trump because we thought he saw through this. If you go back to his run for the presidency and what he said shortly after he took over, he made it pretty clear that he did not regard the Russians as the enemy. In fact, initially in the negotiations that were open with the Russians down in Saudi Arabia, he made it pretty clear he wanted to normalize relations with the Russians, which is very much in our interest, by the way, as well as in their interest.
Right. Well,
So,
everybody, the world's interest with their exports and
of
importing things
course.
there. It works for the EU. It works for America. I'm almost out of time, Colonel. But
Yeah.
I just thought I'd ask you this last one. Do you think, because Zelensky, what was it, day before yesterday, called for a direct three-way and he wants to get Trump involved in the negotiations? I highly doubt President Trump's going to go to Istanbul and sit down with him and Putin. But could it come to that? Should it come to that to actually get peace? Does Trump need to sit there and look these two guys in the eyes and say, hey, this is going to be over now?
No, the president should show up when there's an agreement.
Okay.
Presidents don't do these things.
Gotcha.
You know, we used to call this a Gorbachev summit. You know, Reagan showed up when it was time to sign the agreement. These things are not things for presidents to negotiate. He's got a Secretary of State. He ought to use him,
Okay.
and not just Mr. Witkoff. And I think they need to reboot. The whole basis for the current interaction is nonsense. And I think President Trump needs to go back to where he was. But to go back to a point you made, he's not getting the information and the intelligence.
Well, you
that he
just
should.
informed me of that one. I mean, again, how would you not know that a warring faction you're trying to work with fired at the president of the country they're warring with, that you're trying to bring peace between? I mean, this has happened before in other issues. The people close to Trump don't give him everything he needs to know. You know that, Colonel. I do as well. Anyway,
Exactly.
I got to run. As always, Doug, we appreciate the insight. Thank you, brother.
Super. Thanks very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.